So when I was 7 years old, I saw the movie Toy Story for the first time. And like a lot of people who were around my age when Toy Story came out, I learned valuable lessons about the importance of friendship and the acceptance of others. I also learned that all of my toys are secretly alive and that if I ever get rid of any of them, they will resent me forever because I am the only human being that they have ever loved. That movie turned a generation of kids into pack rats with God complexes, and I was most certainly one of them. By the time I was 8, I had a little more common sense. I still believed that toys had souls, but weren't necessarily alive. Similarly, I still believed in Santa Claus, but had grown increasingly suspicious of his business practices. My best friend, Kim, was a year younger than me. She was 7, and she lived in the cul-de-sac just down the street from my house. And every day, I either walked down there to her house to play or she came up to my house. She preferred coming to my house because I lived next to this very large, spacious forest in Tigard, Oregon, where we would build tree houses or forts and pretend to be escaped convicts on the run from the law. And I liked going over to her house because her parents let us eat cookie dough. My parents never let me eat cookie dough. They said I'd get salmonella. But Kim's parents not only let us eat the cookie dough, but they would actually save a portion of the cookie dough to later spread on top of the freshly baked cookies. It was so good. So I advocated to be at Kim's house as much as possible. And so one afternoon, I was at Kim's house having a make-believe tea party up in her room with her and some of her dolls. Her doll that will be the most pertinent to this story is a doll named Carly, who is entirely made of cloth and has a green felt hat. And as we're having our imaginary tea party, we catch the whiff of the smell of freshly made cookies coming out of the oven downstairs. So we hurry down to the kitchen to get in on some of that. And as usual, it is the most delicious thing that human beings have ever experienced. I really recommend that you try this if you haven't done it. Do yourself a favor. Spread cookie dough on top of your cookie. Shout out to Cookie Dough and Cookie, an innovator here. So we're down there for like 10 minutes, and then we go back up, after the nice break that we've taken from the hard work of pretending to eat snacks to actually eat some. We then go back to our imaginary tea party upstairs, and when we open the door to Kim's room, we see that something is amiss. Carly has moved. And when I say Carly has moved, I don't mean that Carly was gone. I mean, she was face first on the carpet in front of the chair where she had been sitting, and her green felt hat was sitting on the table on top of her imaginary food. A reasonable person might assume that Carly had simply fallen over and her hat had just sort of flopped onto the table in the process. But we were 8 and 7 years old, respectively, and much more importantly, we had both seen the movie Toy Story. So Kim leans into me and she says, I've had my suspicions about this doll. Sometimes I leave her in the middle of the floor in the living room, and the next time I see her, she's in my toy box upstairs. What do you think this means? I asked. But I knew. We were both thinking it. Carly was alive, and she wasn't hiding it as well as the other dolls, which meant maybe we could get her to crack. We devised a plan to get Carly to expose herself. And I don't mean expose herself. Dolls pretty much accidentally do that all the time. But no, our plan was we were going to sit Carly in a chair facing a blank wall, so it was boring and there was nothing for her to do, just sitting in this against the wall. And then we were going to place a single hair clip in her lap, like one of those claspy, clampy hair clips. And then we were going to muss up her hair so it looked really bad and uncomfortable, and she was definitely going to want to use that hair clip. Then we would talk loudly about how we were going to be gone for an extended period of time. thinking that we would then leave the room. Obviously, when left to her own devices alone, the first thing she would do is put the hair clip in her hair, and then we'd come back in and catch her and prove that she was alive. But as I looked into Carly's vacant cloth eyes, I realized that I didn't think Carly was alive. All of a sudden, it occurred to me that the magic that Kim was still able to believe in at 7 had eluded me by 8. And this revelation came as a shock for a number of reasons. The space between us suddenly felt enormous. Were we going to grow apart? What was going to happen when I was 10 and she was 9, or I was 14 and she was 13? That's a high school to middle school difference. Suddenly time felt like it was moving so quickly, and I had to make a decision. And so, when Kim's back was turned as we were leaving the room, I grabbed the hair clip, I placed it on Carly's head, and then I pushed Kim out of the room. I closed the door behind us before she had a chance to look back. And then we waited for a second, and then we burst back into the room, and there was Carly, wearing the hair clip. And Kim looks at me with these big, excited eyes, and I looked back at her with the same big, excited eyes, because I still wanted to believe in magic too. And for the first time, I realized that sometimes you have to make the magic yourself. Thanks, guys. It totally worked for like a couple months, and then Kim's family moved, and I never saw her again, and I was very sad. Meanwhile, all of the other kids my age, all of the other girls, became really obsessed with boys for some reason. I know, what? She knows. She's exactly right. Like, what on earth could ever be so interesting about like a 10-year-old boy? When I was in the 4th grade, I had better things to think about. I had recently discovered the Oregon Trail computer game, and that alone was enough to take up any space that would have been available for boys. By the time I was 10, my relationship with my American Girl doll was a lot more important to me than any guy. Dolls before balls, that's what I always say. Yeah, I like that. Foods before dudes is another submission we have from the audience here. Cookies before Snookies. Okay. So then when I was 11, I got really into fantasy novels. And when I was 12, obviously I was training to be a Pokemon master, which is very time consuming because you got to catch them all. If you see a dugong out in the wild, you got to catch that thing. You know, like, yeah, there are 149 other Pokemon, but dugong is a dual water ice type, and anyway, you need every single Pokemon. My point here is that I didn't have any friends. I had no friends. And that's a lie. I had one friend, and I'm going to tell you a story about her. Her name was Samara. Samara Inthasar Archin. She was born on May 14th. She had one brown eye, one green eye, and bright red, like fire engine red hair. Also, she was a completely made-up person. Maybe the name Inthasar tipped you off. That's not a real name. I have no idea where I came up with that name. She was not a dinosaur, or an insect, or a Russian czar of some kind. No, Samara was a 12-year-old girl. At least as much as she was anything at all. You see, Samara was my imaginary friend. And I should say I had a lot of imaginary friends, but Samara was my best imaginary friend. I took her with me everywhere, to the beach, to the swings in the backyard, to the lobby of my brother's boring karate practices where there was nothing for me to do. And on May 14th, I even built her a cake celebrating the date of her completely arbitrarily determined birth to Lincoln and Griselda Archin, who were themselves also completely imaginary people. I should also mention that I was homeschooled. And living up on that hill by the forest in Tigard, I did not know another child my own age. Sure, my older brother was a year older than me, and my little brother was just 2 years younger. But when you are 12, you need an equal. You need someone who can meet you eye to eye at exactly your level. So who better, really, than a completely imaginary person? And Samara was great. She was smart and thoughtful and funny and pretty, despite the non-matching eyes and fire engine hair. But the thing I liked best about Samara is that she didn't care about boys. Or she was just kind of like shy and insecure and didn't know how to talk to them. But I could relate to these qualities. Except for, unlike me, my imaginary friend actually knew some boys. You see, Samara went to middle school, a real middle school. Yes, an imaginary, real middle school. But she wasn't homeschooled like me. She went to classes and had crushes on boys who were in those classes. Her biggest crush was on this guy named Toby Toymeyer, which is exactly the kind of name you make up for your imaginary best friend's biggest crush when you're 12 years old. And Toby was so cute. He was skinny and blonde and was always pushing his bangs out of his eyes like a kid in a 90s sitcom. His parents owned a chain of toy stores or something. It was very cool. Very imaginary, but also tells you a little something about what I was into as a 12-year-old homeschooled girl. I aspired to someday meet a guy like Toby, sort of milquetoast and wholesome with wealthy toy store owner parents. Again, I had never had a crush on a real boy before, so at this point, everything was speculation. And because everything was speculation, I never imagined that Samara would ever get the courage to talk to a guy like Toby Toymeyer. Or maybe I did imagine that. At first, there was conflict. You see, Samara was, she and her friends were kind of the weirdo artsy kids with crazy hair, and Toby and his friends were like the cool popular kids that wore leather jackets for some reason. And what I had learned from television is that meant there had to be some kind of a social clash. So Samara pretended that she hated Toby just to save face. But that kind of intrigued him because he was so popular. No one had ever really hated him before. It was the perfect 90s teen rom-com plot, and it was spinning out of control in my imagination. Until one day on the school bus, Toby Toymeyer sat down next to Samara Archin. And at first he just asked her some question, just some obvious excuse to talk to her. And she knew it was an excuse. Or she didn't know, but she suspected. Frankly, so did I. And from that moment on, my imaginary friend had a boyfriend, and I still didn't know a single boy in the whole world. I don't know why any of that happened, but that's just the way I imagined it. Samara had everything I wanted: friends, drama, athletic ability. She also had magic power. She could fly, she could levitate things. I may have forgotten to mention that, but all of that was normal. But this boyfriend situation, this was new. Something I didn't even realize I wanted and now couldn't stop picturing highly specific romantic scenarios about. I tried to fill the void however I could, which mostly meant making out with this weird baby doll I had, with a hard plastic head and pouty baby lips. His name was Phil. He was a pretty decent kisser, and I felt very well practiced. But I was ready for the real thing. That summer, I told my mom I wanted to go to a real middle school for the 8th grade. I thought it'd be good for me. I thought it'd be good for Samara, too, so I could picture her middle school experiences more accurately. But secretly, I hoped to make a new friend. A girl my own age who might carry the additional benefit of also being a real person. And in my wildest dreams, I hoped not for a boyfriend, but just for a boy I could gossip about with said girlfriend, maybe over lunch or something, I don't know. I was so unprepared for middle school. On my first day of school, I didn't even know how to open my locker. I'd never had a locker before, and so I was 10 minutes late to my first class on my first day of school, which was a science class. And when I entered the room wearing the baby blue blouse and matching baby blue slacks that I had determined were my best first day of school outfits, everybody stared at me. And my teacher asked, "Are you Brianna Barrett?" And I said, yes, I am. And he said, "Your seat is right over there." And like magic, there appeared one empty seat right next to the cutest boy I had ever seen in my now 15-minute long career as an average middle schooler. He was so cute. He was skinny and blonde and had pouty 90s sitcom lips. His name was Kirby Strom, which I realize sounds like kind of a made-up name, but I swear he was a real person who I sat next to in a real class, in a real middle school, and I had a real crush on him. I was so content. Already, in the first hour of public school, I had a crush on a boy. I didn't need to tell him this. I didn't need to tell anyone this. I didn't need to talk to anyone at all. Actually, I was ready to cash in with the first good thing that had happened to me and ride the wave of the rest of middle school without any expectations. Looking back, this whole voyage into middle school really could have been a horror story. I have heard, in retrospect, that a lot of people really hated middle school because the kids are so mean and the social politics are so intricate, but I wasn't aware of any of that. My fellow classmates did not exist on a spectrum of, are they mean or nice, or are they cool or not, or do they like me or not? I only saw one thing. Are they my age? Yes. Am I surrounded by hundreds of other kids my own age? Yes. Then this is awesome. It's possible that some of those kids were making fun of me, but I didn't notice. I was too busy sketching secret drawings of them in my notebook because I'm really creepy and closely following all of their drama they were getting into with their friends. I had forgotten about any desire to be anyone's friend. Going to the 8th grade was like watching a really elaborate TV show about the 8th grade. I didn't need my own character. I was an audience member only, and I was just delighted with what a good seat I got. But a few months in, the unthinkable happened. These two girls, Celeste and Holly, kept wanting to hang out with me at lunch. And Celeste was sort of glamorous and new agey. She had this long blonde hair and these long, flowing, brightly colored skirts and all of this information about tarot cards and horoscopes and zodiacs. And Holly, by contrast, was kind of a badass rocker chick, as much as you could be in the 8th grade. She had black nail polish and listened to Sublime a lot. But the two of them, though kind of a mixed-match pair, were really, really cool. You know, they liked things I'd never heard of before. They did things that I didn't know existed until then. And at first I was really skeptical, you know, like, why did they want to hang out with me? I'm not even a real person. I'm like this little ghost who's just here to observe what life is like. I didn't have my own storyline. I was just here to see how other people's stories played out. But they didn't think so. They asked me about my life and why I came back to school and what kind of music I was into. And one day, they asked me, "So, do you have a crush on anyone here yet?" And I told them about this guy and how I sit next to him in science and he's in all my classes. I see him all day long. I've never spoken to him before and I'm so awkward. And they just laughed and said they do that same kind of thing all the time too. And at some point, I realized that I wasn't here to watch life happen. I was here to live it. I mean, here I was standing at lunch, gossiping about boys with 2 actual friends. My first 2 actual friends that I had had in years. Maybe the only 2 I would have for years, because I was pretty weird. But they were pretty weird too. And in all these great ways you couldn't make up. And I think at the end of the day, that's what real friends are for. You know, after a few months went by, I realized I hadn't thought about Samara in months, probably. And all of the parts of my personality that had been partitioned off to become Samara seemed to have folded back in and were now just me again. And, you know, that's the value of having true friends. Whether it's helping you forget about your imaginary friends, or giving you advice about that guy that it's just never gonna happen with, or gently explaining that you're just really not pulling off that outfit. A real friend, a true friend, is indispensable, because a real friend reminds us who we are. Thank you.
Let's hear it for Brianna.